It's not something that's unique to the West or to Europe and North America. It's becoming global.
Hey John, and thanks for joining Dukascopy TV today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. We're going to have a little look today at the rise of populism, which has been all over the news as of late, especially in 2016. That was the big year for it. So to start off with, where would you say it's occurring to start off with?
I think it's probably the most interesting thing about it, Jack, is that we tend to focus on what the Brexit vote in the United States, the Brexit vote in Britain, the recent election in the United States, events in Europe such as Greece and elsewhere, but really it's quite a global phenomenon. If you look at the Philippines, there's rise of a populist movement there, Japan, Australia. It's not something that's unique to the West or to Europe and North America. It's becoming global.
This year, are we going to see a lot more? We've got many elections across Europe where, there's predictions that stuff like that might happen. Do you think it's going to keep rising and growing stronger this year?
I think there's a couple things that are going on and they're probably not entirely predictable. This seems to be a fluid movement, and it's a movement that's being powered by social networks and information technology. So trying to predict where populism goes is not easy. I don't think we've seen the end of it, and I say that partly because this isn't necessarily a recent phenomenon, although people are focusing on it much more now because of recent events. This really goes back to the 1960s and maybe beyond. The polling that's been done on popular attitudes towards political establishments and politics, but also to the media, to the judicial system, the church, education institutions. In other words, what we take to be the establishment elites. These kind of declines in deference and growing skepticism, we've seen that since the 1960s. Probably Vietnam War helped fuel it, Watergate, assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy. Around about that time, you start seeing public skepticism of institutions and politics and establishment figures rising. So the idea that it will suddenly go away or that it's a problem that can be solved, I think, is probably misleading.
So that's an interesting point you make there with it going back as far as the 60s, because people think it's like 2016 and the rise of populism, boom, it's here. So where would you say more recently we've kind of, where's it coming from? Like we've seen this back in the 60s, but more recently where?
Well, that's another good point. I mean, I guess a lot of people who look at this, experts who look at it, would trace it to the 2008 financial crisis and say, look, that not only did establishment politicians not see it coming, but economists didn't see it coming. The Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the European Central Bank didn't see it coming. And suddenly this crisis hits and it shakes faith in not only the experts, but also the institutions that underpin globalizations and our world economy. The idea that we were inexorably progressing, that everyone was moving to democracy, that the world was getting more knit together and more integrated and more open. Suddenly, with this crisis, all that's called into question. So definitely the financial crisis played a part. But again, it goes back beyond that. I mean, I think, as I say, you can see these trends starting in the 60s. They accelerate probably in the 1980s and 1990s, when the big structural changes we see in the global economy, increasing polarization of wealth, disappearance of manufacturing jobs and traditional industrial jobs start evaporating. That kind of disenchantment with the system, this idea that the system is broken and not working, starts to gain traction. So again, I think you can find a lot of inflection points, but not one single cause.
So how do you see the system, as you say, or the establishment is another word that's been used, how do you see the reaction from them?
Well, that's something that, again, remains to be seen. I think there's a kind of a dilemma that politicians and the political establishment face, and we see that dilemma in a sense with Donald Trump's election. And it's one thing to run against the establishment and to run against the machine. But at some point, of course, you actually have to become the machine. You actually have to run it yourself. And it's very difficult to tread that line between I'm one of you, I'm against them, or I'm against the established order, and then suddenly gaining power and having to make the decisions that your predecessors made, having to weigh the different trade-offs that invariably come with politics. You yourself run the risk as an elected official of becoming perceived as part of the problem, just like the same old crowd. You become the swamp that needed to be drained. So I think that's one dilemma. The other dilemma is that you find in populist movements, especially ones that stress skepticism about globalization, skepticism about international cooperation, the idea that there's some kind of conspiracy to keep people from having their sovereignty and their rights. It's very difficult to coordinate those movements across national boundaries. I mean, you see this in Europe right now. The idea that that populist nationalist movements in disparate countries could coordinate their actions is almost a contradiction in terms, because they're in fact reacting against that very exercise in coordination. So I'm not entirely sure how the elites respond, but I think the answer lies somewhere in embracing the fact that populism is going to be with us, that it's not going to disappear. I mean, in the same way that your industry, for example, Jack, has had to embrace the idea that established media has to change. It has to become more interactive, has to become more, in a sense, disaggregated, has to allow for user feedback, has to embrace the internet. Politics and political systems are going to have to become like that.
So just finally, we've understood that it's here and it's here to stay, and we need to kind of not necessarily embrace it, but start adapting to it. What are some of the implications that are going to come from it?
Well, I think one of the first implications, and you're asking exactly the right questions, is that we have to stop calling it populism. What is maybe your populism or my populism is someone else's legitimate exercise of their franchise and their legitimate opinions and their views about the world. And their skepticism about a lot of the things that in the past the political elites took for granted. I mean, we can say that this uprising or this populist movement is maybe ill-informed or not sufficiently deferential to experts or to the people making decisions. But maybe if you look at it from the other end of the telescope, they're actually saying things pretty accurately. They're saying the flaws that exist in all humans. We all make mistakes. They're saying that people who used to be considered elites and almost deities in the past, would afforded huge respect, are just flesh and blood humans like us. So part of the challenge will be, if you can't beat them, to join them and to start acting, I guess, if I can use this word, in a more populist way. It's going to have to be less them versus us, and we're all them now.
John, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching. And if you like this video and would like to see more, be sure to head over to dukascopy.tv.